So I'm Jim Spaeth. I'm Alice's partner, my claim to fame. And I want to start the day here. I want to introduce John Leeman. Excuse me. John Leeman is the former CMO of FreshDirect and now the founder and managing partner of True Customer. One thing we want to do through this day is take an advertiser's perspective. This is about as geeky a topic as you can get into, as many of you in the room know. And we want to make sure we're always grounded in the business needs and the business applications. And John is going to start us there with a great talk from the CMO's perspective. John?
There's no clicker? No? Thanks. So thank you very much, Sequent Partners and Green Book. I appreciate the chance to be here. I think it's pretty much settled science that customer-obsessed companies are using the right strategy, and I think it's really smart for these guys to start the day off with a viewpoint of what the customer and the buyer is thinking about from an attribution standpoint. I think filtering the whole conference through that lens will help everybody understand what the needs are and kind of adapt and adjust to the right strategies to make the attribution space move forward as quickly as possible. So when we talk about being scared to death, or the C-Suite being scared to death, marketers or CFOs or CEOs, what are we talking about? What mostly we're talking about at the beginning of the conversation when we're thinking about entering the category is the fear of picking the right solution or picking the right data set, or a fear that this might actually not work or harm the business initially, and so that's a scary thing. And then also a fear of how this might change the mindset or the decision-making power of marketers. Marketers are very creative and they want to be able to think these things through and be able to affect their own futures. And I think this sometimes makes people feel like they're going to be in a situation where everything's rote and they're not going to be able to be in control anymore. And sometimes these fears can cause you to freeze like a deer in the headlights. And sometimes you'll see that, as you've probably experienced, if those of you who are suppliers, that pitches will just go dark or people won't make any decisions at all and they'll be paralyzed a little bit from a lot of these different fears. But the reality is that there's more than, you're not just able to stand at we marketers are not just able to stand at the end of the diving board forever and think about this. There's a lot of pressures behind us, pushing us to the end of the plank to become more accountable, to get our data and to get our situations in a situation where we're improving. The rest of the company is improving and becoming more accountable, and marketing is no exception. But with those fears also comes the promise of a better world and a more granular ability to look at the performance of your marketing and an ability to make decisions faster than they have been in the past with other kinds of modeling, or if you have nothing at all, certainly more informed decisions than before. And so that's the optimistic promise. So once you decide that you want to get into the space, you're really hopeful that you'll be able to experience these great positive benefits. But after you get into the space and you decide that you want to take the plunge, you've got another set of fears. So you've already boarded the plane, but you still have some anxieties. And some of the anxieties around, how's my organization going to handle this? We're already kind of siloed from a creative standpoint, or maybe different P&Ls or merchandising groups. I've done consulting groups with retailers where different divisions or different domain brands have their own budgets. How do you optimize across these things for the betterment of the company? There's also the struggle or the nervousness about how my team's going to be able to handle this stuff. They're already at capacity, or maybe they're not as smart as all these attribution suppliers that I meet, so how are we going to handle this? And then kind of as an adjunct to that, how are we going to get into this thing? We're already super busy. I don't know how we're going to test into a new methodology while we keep the lights on with the basic methodology. So there's all these kinds of anxieties that are driving it. So what I'm going to talk about today is a way to overcome multiple different fears. And this is a popular one that people have used for overcoming the fear of entrepreneurship. You don't have to read it. It's not going to be on the test. But essentially, overcoming barrier after barrier after barrier. And I think the strategy is you take them one at a time. Ideally, you can layer them up in the order that they really hit people and overcome them logically on a linear path. For attribution, multi-touch attribution, we have a number of different barriers, and I'm going to go into these one at a time. And there are others, I'm sure, but I'm going to try to offer you some insights as to how, as a marketer or someone who works with CFOs and CEOs and their expectations and pressures that they apply to me, how we could overcome these rationally and how it'll enable us to move forward better together. So the first thing is how accurate is this stuff going to be? I don't know if you've ever heard this term horseshoes and hand grenades, but the reality of that is that it doesn't have to be perfectly accurate to be effective. And I think attribution, marketing attribution, falls into this category today, not only because it really needs to be relatively accurate across marketing channels and relatively accurate over time, but also the data is constantly changing and getting better. Things are becoming more digital when they were less digital before, and so the expectation that whatever you're using today is going to be the same level of accuracy tomorrow is a false expectation. And I think a lot of suppliers maybe set the expectation of over-accuracy too, and so then you set up the perfect being the enemy of the good, or maybe it's vice versa on that. And then another thing that is very common is attribution companies come in, and people are very interested in this topic, but they come in and they see the world orbiting around attribution. And they see different things that they plugged into attribution to make attribution even more effective. And sometimes these are different things like media planning tools or DMPs or DSPs are required for these programs to work. And I think the reality is something that's useful for either agencies or attribution companies is that from a business standpoint, the business is what the world is what orbits around the sun. And so you have to understand their first priority is almost and should be always delivering the business. So that could be in ERP and supply chain and the customer experience and customer service and some of those key things. And even within the marketing realm, acquisition or certain aspects that are already, some way attributable. And then within the marketing sphere is the attribution aspect. So I think to me, it's not like attribution isn't important, and it's not like people don't want to improve their marketing attribution, but they have another world around them. And so I think it's important for attribution or agencies to realize that, hey, if maybe the most important thing in the business is connected to my media planning tool or connected to a particular data source, maybe my suggestion of having them change that just to accommodate attribution isn't realistic. And so being flexible on how you can accommodate a different set of priorities besides one that's where attribution is the top priority can be really helpful, and it can be really useful from the customer's perspective and being able to see their way forward to making a decision. Another thing, now we're talking with our friends Frank and Claire will say anything to get in or stay in office. And I think one of the things that I've noticed in talking to different attribution companies is that they tend to want to be everything to everyone. And I think one of the things that could really help me as a marketer and help companies is that if the market were to self-segment a little bit better and to decide and identify which areas they're the best for and be deferential for the areas that they're not. I don't think there's anything that would be more powerful than taking a meeting and having somebody say, oh, well, you're a pure play e-commerce company, and so you're really, and all your marketing or almost all of your marketing is digital, so you're really going to be better suited for this kind of a solution. We're a multi-channel solution that's really set up for heavy amounts of on and offline communications and maybe direct sales, and that's our sweet spot for large global companies. Having that candid conversation and helping segment the market for someone can be really powerful. And then when people like me are mixing it up at the ANA last week with lots of different friends and colleagues who are in many different industries, there's nothing more valuable than me referring you as somebody who I've heard is perfect for a particular solution, even though it wasn't for me. And that's a really powerful thing. I think right now, there is no tide for whiter than white, cheer for cold and colors, and gain for fragrant scents. It's everybody's trying to be everything, and it makes it really confusing. And then it makes, as a buyer, I have to figure this out myself, and I have to sift through the truths and non-truths and half-truths to figure out which one's really right for me. And I think an evolved category would be able to segment itself a little better, and I think it'll be more efficient in that way when it does. Another thing is I think this sector is known for having many geniuses in it, and the people that you guys spend your time, whether you be at agencies or at attribution suppliers, we know you know your stuff. But that's kind of scary for us sometimes because we don't always know how much we're going to need you, and we know that when we're sitting in a conversation with the founder or the chief strategy officer or somebody that we know is not going to be assigned to my business on a day-to-day basis, it makes me afraid that I'm going to need that person and they're not going to be there. So I think explaining the layers of need of the geniuses to build the machine and somebody who's a good protege of that genius to help support the machine, and maybe even the kind of training that you only need for you to help you run the machine yourself, being really clear about that up front can alleviate a lot of fears. And I think the more you can be honest about that, if your machine requires a lot of support, explain that you're set up with a lot of support core to your business, and explain why your margins are lower or your prices are higher or whatever is going to be necessary to make that real. But I think that's going to be a rational fear that we're all going to be able to see and assume that you can help overcome. Then we're talking a little bit about the creative box that you might be thinking you're putting yourselves in when you get into this. I think a lot of people, when they think about it right offhand, they think, oh, marketing attribution, especially if you listen to the Frank and Claire claims of how perfect this is going to be and how many answers are going to be answered by the solution, you might be worried that there's not going to be that much decision-making left for you to do, and that your team might be nervous that they're going to be beholden to these reports. And this is so not true. There are so many different things that attribution needs human intervention and judgment on. As you roll in, for one example would be, as you're rolling in an optimization for a particular media channel, we know that media channels don't scale on a linear path. If you have, old direct marketers know this, the first decile on a list does not perform the same as the seventh decile on a list. So if you're doing, same with digital, the first 5 million impressions are not going to perform the same as the billionth impression. So you're going to have to phase into a lot of these optimizations, and how you phase in and what the marketplace of where you're phasing into looks like is going to require judgment. Same thing with synergy effect, how you look at the different channels working together. Are you going to partition off a market to test that, or are you going to do it in the overall market? Those are things that humans are going to need to be able to be using judgment and deciding how these things go to predict the outcomes before the analytics are done. And also, this is not the best use of human creativity either, and the time that you guys get back, you can spend on trying to build your brands with emotion, with culture, coming up with new ideas like Anheuser-Busch did with Budweiser in the Olympics, trying to triangulate the patriotism of the Budweiser brand with the timeliness and the media platform that is the Olympics and their go-to-market program. That's a really smart idea, and I know some of my former colleagues from American Express are here, and Small Business Saturday is another great example of triangulating these things and bringing. Those are the kinds of creative ideas that an attribution solution is not going to help in, that you need creative thinking on. So I think it's misplaced fear to think about putting yourselves in too much of a decision-making box. There's plenty of interesting work to do, even with attribution, and attribution should help you find more time to do that work. So this is a slide. Jim didn't know what this was, so I have to explain it. This is a slide of the magic trick of sawing the woman in half on the stage. So I didn't know this either, but you used 2 women. Makes sense, I guess. But I think a lot of people in the attribution solution need to know what's going on under the hood with these things. And I think, if nothing else, there's a lot of other things going on with their marketing. They need to know that about everything. So even if it's complicated, we know that if things go wrong, or if there's something that happens that's not predicted, or under certain pressure, or if you're needing to make a case for a much larger investment or a much faster migration to something, the CMO and the CFO need to understand how this stuff works, so you need to be able to explain it to them. It cannot be too much of a black box, even if it's using neural nets or something where it is technically not exactly explainable. You have to explain what neural nets are and how that works, and how that you're never going to know exactly what the algorithm is because it's constantly changing. We need to understand that sort of thing. It's our responsibility to the rest of the company, and once you explain it, then we can start moving forward and feeling good about the things we're doing. So my lesson on this and moving forward is take a deep breath, relax, go try to understand what your barriers are for your particular customers. Ideally, on a funnel basis, the bigger macro ones as you work your way down into the ones that are more precise as they get closer to the bottom of the funnel, and help them overcome each of these barriers. And once they overcome these barriers, the jump that they're trying to take is not going to be scary. It should be exhilarating. It should be something they're expecting and they're enthusiastic about, and they can't wait to get started on. So I would now like to offer if there are any questions. Thank you.
If someone has a question for John, we do have time for about one really great question. Or you can catch him afterwards at the break.
So one common question I get, I'll just serve myself up the question, is on the attribution side, if you're paying for this license for this attribution, how do you rationalize the ROI over time? It seems like you're going to make a bunch of big optimizations at the beginning, and then it should plane out, and if I don't have a really dynamic space, then how is it worth what I'm paying for? And I think that's kind of a false perspective too, because I think you don't really make the kinds of radical changes if you're a large organization that needs to use this stuff because it's in such a risk position that it needs it. You're not going to make the kind of radical changes in 1 year where everything's done. You're going to need to phase things in. You're going to learn how things go. You're going to be able to have layers of learning. There may be media channel optimization at one point, but then for sales, but then you might do an EBITDA or a profit optimization, and then you might do a segment relevance optimization as you go down. So there's a constant flow of improvements that you're going to do over more time than one particular thing. But then I think ultimately you do, as a supplier, need to be aware of the improvements that you're making and make sure that those are squared with the costs.
Great. Thank you so much, John.
You're welcome.
That's terrific. Thanks.